Some mornings are not loud. No sirens, no bursting tears, only a silence so dense that it feels as if it presses against the chest, making every breath more difficult than usual. That morning, Oak Hill Memorial Park Cemetery on the outskirts of Chicago was wrapped entirely in that kind of silence. The sky was pale gray, no rain, no sunlight. A neutral, emotionless gray, as if nature itself had chosen to stand aside, neither judging nor comforting. Rows of old maple trees stood motionless, their leaves beginning to turn yellow. Occasionally, a leaf drifted down onto the damp, cold ground, making no sound loud enough to break the heavy atmosphere hanging over everything. Beneath a temporary white canopy erected in the middle of the cemetery, a funeral was underway. All the mourners were dressed in black, carefully tailored suits, minimalist black dresses, unshowy yet expensive. Familiar faces from Chicago's financial, technology, and medical circles. People shook hands softly and spoke in barely audible voices, as if raising their volume even slightly would be considered disrespectful. At the center of it all stood a coffin coated in pale gold lacquer, placed directly beside the already dug grave. Inside the coffin lay Evelyn Carter, 52 years old. The woman once known as the steel brain of the American medical technology industry. The founder and CEO of Carter Systems, the corporation that held medical data for millions of Americans. Now she lay there, motionless, eyes closed, skin pale, almost waxen. Her hands folded neatly on her chest, fingers cold, devoid of life. From a distance, she looked as if she were merely asleep, a sleep so deep that no one dared speak her name. Standing beside the coffin was Richard Carter, her husband, 55 years old, tall, impeccably dressed in a classic black suit, a dark gray tie knotted so perfectly that not a single crease could be seen. In his hand, he held a neatly folded white handkerchief. His eyes were red, just enough for others to believe he had cried a great deal. Richard stood straight. His shoulders did not shake, his back did not bend. The posture of a man accustomed to controlling everything around him. Those who did not know him well would say he was the image of a grieving yet resilient husband. Except, Richard's grief seemed too tidy, too orderly, too proper. In the front row of seats, Margaret Lewis, Evelyn's aunt, sat in silence. She was in her 70s, her silver hair neatly combed, her thin hands resting on her familiar wooden cane. Her gaze never left the coffin. She did not cry. She did not speak. But in her eyes was something that resembled an unanswered question. Just across from her, Dr. Thomas Blake stood slightly withdrawn within the crowd. His long coat concealed most of his body. His glasses reflected the faint light of the gray morning. He had been the Carter family's personal physician for over 10 years. The man who had signed the death certificate stated the cause of death: sudden cardiac failure. That document now rested quietly in the legal file. Neat, valid, unquestioned. The officiant, an elderly pastor, cleared his throat and opened his Bible. His voice was deep, slow, and steady as it echoed through the quiet space. "We are gathered here today to bid farewell to Evelyn Carter, a mother, a leader, a human being who left a profound mark." Familiar words, sentences everyone had heard at some funeral at some point in their lives. Two cemetery workers stood behind the canopy waiting. The ropes were already in position. They exchanged a glance, waiting for the signal. Just a nod. The coffin would be lowered. Everything would be over. No one knew that everything was only beginning. A light breeze passed through, causing the canopy's white fabric to flutter slightly. In that moment, Margaret Lewis suddenly felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. She did not know why. There were no apparent signs, no evidence, only a vague feeling that something was wrong. At the outer edge of the crowd, where few people paid attention, a man stood quietly. He wore a worn security uniform, the dark blue faded with time. An old baseball cap was pulled low, partially hiding a gaunt face with unshaven stubble. The name badge on his chest read, Daniel Brooks, 45 years old, night shift security guard at Oak Hill Cemetery. He did not belong there. At least, not at this formal ceremony. No one noticed him. No one asked who he was. He was simply part of the background, like the rows of trees, the gravel path, the cold ground beneath their feet. But Daniel's eyes, they were not the eyes of a man merely doing his job. They were tense, focused, and filled with a deep, hidden fear. Daniel stared at the coffin, not with mourning, but with the gaze of someone counting every second. When the pastor reached the final prayer, when the two workers stepped forward, Daniel felt his heart pounding so hard it nearly drowned out every other sound. There was no time. He knew that, because only a few hours earlier, he had overheard a conversation he should never have heard. A conversation in the dark, inside a luxury car parked out of sight behind the cemetery, between two people who believed no one else existed. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands clenched until they turned white. If he stayed silent, if he turned away as he had so many times before in his life, then in just a few minutes, a human being would be buried alive, and he would carry that memory for the rest of his life. The pastor's voice rang out more clearly. "Please prepare." Daniel took a deep breath, and then, to the shock of everyone present, he stepped out of the crowd. His voice tore through the silence like a blade. "Stop!" Everyone turned. A few phones were instinctively raised, stunned expressions, whispers fading into nothing. Daniel took another step forward, his voice steady even as his heart felt ready to burst from his chest. "Don't bury her. She is not dead." The silence that followed was no longer the silence of a funeral. It was the silence of a bomb that had just been activated. And at that exact moment, on Richard Carter's face for the first time, a tiny crack appeared. In a funeral, the most frightening thing is not the sound of crying. It is when silence is torn apart. After Daniel Brooks's shout, Oak Hill Cemetery could no longer maintain its original solemnity. The space seemed to freeze in a single, irregular heartbeat. The white fabric of the canopy trembled slightly, whether from the wind or from hundreds of breaths being held at the same time, no one could tell. All eyes turned toward the man in the worn security uniform. Some people frowned. Some stepped back half a pace. Some instinctively activated the cameras on their phones, the reflex of the modern age, faster than thought itself. Daniel stood there in the gravel walkway, his back straight, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. His heart was pounding violently, but his gaze did not waver. He stared directly at the coffin where Evelyn Carter lay, as if he were the only person in that crowd who truly saw her. "Who is he?" a whispered voice came from behind. "A cemetery employee?" Another voice followed, edged with irritation. "Call security." Within seconds, those scattered whispers began to merge into a wave of suspicion. Two security guards in black suits immediately moved forward, their motions professional, their expressions cold. But before they could reach Daniel, another voice rang out, deep, slow, carrying the familiar authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. "What is going on here?" Richard Carter stepped forward from his position beside the coffin. He was still holding the white handkerchief in his hand, but it was no longer neatly folded. The creases had begun to crumple, like the composure he was struggling to maintain. Richard looked Daniel up and down. That gaze was not curiosity, not concerned. It was the gaze of a man whose plans were being interrupted. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard said. His voice was not loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. "This is my wife's funeral." Daniel took a deep breath. He knew this moment was the point of no return. Once he had stepped forward, he could no longer retreat, as he had done so many times before in his life. "I know," Daniel said, his voice hoarse but clear. "And that's exactly why I can't stay silent." A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd, not amused laughter, but the kind filled with doubt, a reflex when people are confronted with something too abnormal. Richard frowned. "Do you know what you're saying?" he asked. "She has passed away. The doctor confirmed it. The legal documents are complete. We are trying to lay her to rest in peace." Daniel turned to face Richard directly. For the first time, their eyes met. And in that very brief moment, Richard realized something that sent a chill down his spine. The man standing before him was not afraid. "I know she's not dead," Daniel said. "Not in the way everyone here believes." A louder murmur spread through the crowd. "What are you implying?" Richard demanded. Daniel raised his hand and pointed straight at the coffin. "There is a toxin," he said slowly, each word carefully weighed. "It slows the heart rate to the point that it's almost impossible to detect using standard methods. It makes the skin cold. Breathing becomes so faint it seems to have stopped." He paused. "It makes a person look dead while they are still alive." The air seemed to freeze. Dr. Thomas Blake, standing at the edge of the crowd, flinched slightly. It was a tiny movement, but enough for Margaret Lewis, who had lived long enough to read the subtlest human reactions, to notice. She turned her head toward him. Her eyes darkened. "That's enough," Richard cut in, impatience now evident in his voice. "You're making baseless claims. Grief can make people lose their reason, but you have no right to disrupt this funeral." He turned to the security guards. "Remove him." The two men in black suits stepped forward again. Daniel felt a wave of panic surge through his chest, not because of them, but because of time. Every second that passed could be a second Evelyn lost her chance to survive. "Wait." The voice was not loud, but it was enough to make everyone stop. Margaret Lewis rose from her seat. She stepped forward slowly but steadily, her wooden cane tapping lightly against the damp ground. "I want to hear him continue," she said. Richard turned toward her, irritation flashing briefly in his eyes. "Aunt Margaret, this is not the time." "Richard," she interrupted, her voice calm but leaving no room for argument. "If there is even a 1% chance, we do not have the right to ignore it." The crowd began to stir more noticeably. A woman in the second row whispered, "What if he's right?" "It's just another check," another voice added. "What's the harm?" Richard felt sweat bead at his temples. He smiled, a strained smile. "We're letting emotions guide us," he said. "Dr. Blake has fulfilled his responsibilities." All eyes immediately turned toward the doctor. Thomas Blake swallowed. "Yes," he said, his voice slightly higher than usual. "I examined her. No pulse, no reflexes. There is no reason for doubt." Daniel turned toward him. "Doctor," he said, his voice not aggressive yet unsettling in a different way, the way truth often is. "Did you check core body temperature? Did you use deep cardiac monitoring equipment?" Blake froze for a beat that lasted too long. Richard immediately interjected, You have no standing to interrogate my family's doctor. I'm not interrogating, Daniel replied. I'm trying to save a life. A silence fell. Margaret Lewis stepped closer, standing nearer to the coffin. She looked at Evelyn, the niece she had once held in her arms as a newborn. She placed a hand on her own chest as if trying to soothe a nameless pain. If I allow it, she said slowly. Just a recheck. What is wrong with that? Richard looked around. The gazes were beginning to shift. They no longer fully trusted him. In that moment, Richard realized the most dangerous thing was not Daniel Brooks. There was doubt. If this turns out to be a farce, he said, his voice hardening, then the responsibility will be yours. Daniel nodded. I accept. No hesitation, no conditions. A heavy silence enveloped the crowd. And somewhere, deep inside that sealed coffin, a fragile life was still waiting, not for a miracle, but for human courage. The two cemetery workers stepped back, exchanging glances. They had not been trained to face moments like this. Daniel moved one step closer to the coffin. He whispered, very softly, as if speaking to only one person. Hold on. Please don't let go. Margaret Lewis placed a hand on his shoulder. Her hand trembled, but her eyes were steadier than ever. And behind them, Richard Carter, the man who appeared to be the most grief-stricken at the funeral, took half a step back. No one noticed. But that very moment, it was the moment the mask began to crack. There are moments in life when time no longer moves by minutes and seconds. It contracts, thickens, grows so heavy that every breath feels like a silent prayer. That moment was enveloping Oak Hill Cemetery. After Margaret Lewis spoke, no one said another word. The crowd, people accustomed to appearing on the covers of financial magazines, faces hardened by power, now stood motionless, like statues. Daniel Brooks stood beside the coffin. The distance was only a few steps, but to him, it felt as long as an entire lifetime. He could hear his heart beating, not in his ears, but in his throat. Each beat carried a wordless question. Am I doing the right thing? He had never studied medicine. He held no degree, no authority. He possessed only one thing that no one else there had, the truth he had overheard. Daniel looked down at the coffin. Evelyn Carter lay there, unmoving. If one did not know better, one would think she was at rest. Her face was peaceful, no twitching, no sign of panic. A death too neat, too clean. And that was what terrified Daniel. He lowered himself, kneeling on one knee against the cold ground. The gesture sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. A few people stepped back as if afraid of touching something forbidden. What are you doing? Richard Carter growled from behind. You're not allowed to— Just 1 minute, Daniel said without turning around. Just 1 minute. His voice was not loud, but in the silence stretched tight as a drawn wire, it rang out with frightening clarity. Daniel removed the old jacket he was wearing and folded it carefully. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were preparing for a solemn ritual, not of death, but of last hope. He placed the neatly folded jacket on the ground right beside the coffin. We need to raise her slightly, Daniel said, addressing the crowd. Her neck must be elevated, the airway must be open. A few people exchanged hesitant looks. No one wanted to be the first to touch the body. No one wanted to bear responsibility if this was wrong. Margaret Lewis stepped forward. She asked no further questions. She bent down and placed her hand against the side of the coffin. Her thin hand trembled slightly, but she did not withdraw it. Lift her, she said. If there is a God, He is watching us. Two young women from the second row stepped out, fear in their eyes, but determination as well. A man in a black suit also moved forward, placing his hands beneath Evelyn's shoulders. At the same time, Richard Carter rushed toward them. "Stop!" he shouted. "I forbid this!" But this time, no one turned to look at him. They gently lifted Evelyn, just enough for Daniel to slide the folded jacket beneath her neck, forming a makeshift pillow. In that moment, the distance between death and life seemed terrifyingly thin. Up close, Evelyn did not look like someone who had died. Her long lashes cast shadows across her cheeks. Her lips were pale but not bluish, and just beneath her nostrils, a small piece of white cotton placed very carefully. Daniel saw it, and his heart clenched. "Please," he said softly, turning to Margaret. "Remove that cotton." Margaret hesitated for a second, not out of fear, but because she understood the weight of the act. She raised her hand and touched Evelyn's nose. Her fingers trembled, but were decisive. The cotton was pulled away. The air around them seemed to change. No one said it aloud, but many felt it, as if the cemetery itself had just taken a deep breath. Daniel reached into his pocket. When he pulled out a small brown glass vial, the crowd let out a quiet gasp. The vial was old, scratched, looking nothing like anything that belonged at a high society funeral. "What is that?" someone whispered. Daniel raised the vial high enough for everyone to see. "An antidote," he said. "Just one drop." Richard Carter went pale. "You're insane!" he screamed. "Are you trying to poison my wife right here?" "Doctor," Margaret turned to Thomas Blake, her voice dropping. "If she is truly dead, then this will do nothing. Isn't that right?" Thomas Blake opened his mouth, then it closed it. 1 second, 2 seconds. That silence said everything. "No!" he burst out, his voice shrill, unsteady. "No one is allowed to introduce an unknown substance into a patient's body." "Patient?" Margaret repeated, her eyes sharp as a blade. "You just called her a patient?" The crowd erupted into murmurs. Richard took one step back, then another. Sweat ran down his temples, soaking into the collar of his white shirt. Daniel opened the vial. A small click sounded, but in that moment it rang like metal striking stone. He held the glass dropper. His hand no longer trembled. "Margaret," he said softly, "please help me open her mouth." Margaret bent down and gently parted Evelyn's lips with 2 fingers. Another man lightly lifted Evelyn's shoulders, angling her head just right. The entire cemetery leaned with them. Richard shouted something, but no one could make it out. His voice was swallowed by the heartbeat of hundreds of people pounding in unison. Daniel bent low. The dropper hovered just above Evelyn's lips. "Just one drop," he whispered. "Hold on. Please don't leave." The clear liquid fell, very slowly. It touched Evelyn's tongue. Nothing happened. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. A sudden cold wind swept through, making the white fabric whip more violently. Someone sobbed. Another person whispered a prayer. Daniel swallowed hard. He lifted the dropper again. "No!" Richard screamed, lunging forward. "Don't you dare!" Margaret raised her hand to block him. "Stand still," she said, her voice trembling but hard as steel. "This is no longer your decision." Daniel squeezed gently. The second drop fell, and in a moment so fragile that no one dared trust their own senses, Evelyn Carter coughed, very lightly, very weakly, but unmistakably. Not the wind, not imagination. A sound of life. Did I hear that?" someone whispered. Evelyn swallowed. Her throat contracted slightly. Her pale lips trembled, parting. Another cough escaped, clearer this time. The cemetery erupted. Screams, crying, prayers. Daniel immediately leaned closer, his eyes blazing like fire. "She's coming back," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I told you. She's alive." Margaret placed her hand on Evelyn's wrist. Her eyes widened. "It's warming up," she whispered. "Oh my God. It's getting warm." Some people dropped to their knees crying. Others clutched each other. And in the midst of the chaos, Richard Carter stood frozen. No handkerchief, no grief, only a face twisted with panic and rage. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket. A metallic object glinted beneath the pale gray morning light. Daniel looked up. "Richard," he said loudly, "look at her." Everyone turned. They saw something none of them had ever imagined they would witness in their lifetime. Evelyn Carter's chest rose and fell, weakly, but undeniably. Her eyelids fluttered like a heavy door struggling to open after a sleep that had lasted far too long. And when those eyes opened, even if only by the narrowest slit, death, for the first time that morning, truly stepped back. There are moments in life when thunder is not needed for everything to collapse. All it takes is a breath returning. Evelyn Carter's chest rose and fell weakly, but steadily. Each rise and fall was a silent yet undeniable declaration. She was alive. Oak Hill Cemetery fell into a state of chaos unlike anything it had ever known. Crying broke out like a dam bursting. Fragmented prayers echoed. Calls for God, for miracles, rang out from people who were accustomed to controlling their emotions in public. Daniel Brooks remained kneeling beside Evelyn. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a relief so overwhelming it nearly stole his breath. He leaned in close, listening to every faint cough, every fragile breath. "She needs air," Daniel said quickly, his voice no longer a plea but an instinctive command. "Please, don't crowd around her." Several people immediately stepped back. Others remained frozen, as if afraid that if they blinked, this moment would vanish. Margaret Lewis clasped Evelyn's hand tightly. Hot tears streamed down her aged face. "You're here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here with you." Across from them, Richard Carter stood motionless. No more shouting, no more commands. Only a man abandoned in the truth he had failed to conceal. His eyes darted rapidly like a cornered animal. His hand remained inside his jacket pocket, where the cold metal pressed against his skin, reminding him that the plan was not entirely over. "Back away!" Richard suddenly shouted, his voice hoarse, distorted. "Everyone, step back!" A few people flinched. A woman pulled a child standing beside her backwards. The tension snapped back instantly like a string drawn tight again after it had seemed to loosen. Daniel slowly stood up. He did not rush forward. He did not shout. He positioned himself between Richard and Evelyn. "Don't do something you can never undo," Daniel said. His voice was low, steady, carrying no defiance, only a sincere warning. Richard laughed, a twisted, trembling laugh. "Who do you think you are?" he snarled. "A cemetery guard who thinks he has the right to destroy my life?" "No," Daniel replied. "I'm just someone who can't turn away one more time." Richard shook his head as if trying to dispel a nightmare. "It should have been over," he muttered. "All it took was lowering that coffin, and it would have been done." That sentence, soft, unconscious, still reached many ears. The crowd fell abruptly silent. Another silence. Not the silence of a funeral, but the silence of realization. "What did you just say?" Margaret turned toward him, her voice icy. "You said it should have been over?" Richard jolted. His eyes widened like a man who had realized he had spoken what should never have been spoken. I just," he stammered. At that moment, the sound of police sirens rose in the distance. At first, faint, then clearer, closer. Red and blue lights began to flash beyond the cemetery gates, reflecting off gray stone headstones, creating a scene both surreal and chilling. Someone had called the police. It did not matter who. What mattered was this. The wheels of justice had begun to turn. Richard turned toward the sound. In that brief instant, his expression collapsed completely. He pulled his hand from his jacket pocket. The metal object fell to the ground with a sharp, dry clatter. A syringe. Inside it, a cloudy liquid shifted slightly. A sharp breath escaped from the crowd. My God. No way. He was going to. Daniel bent down and picked up the syringe, holding it between two fingers, as if afraid that touching it more firmly would provoke whatever was inside. He looked at Richard. "What was this for?" he asked. Richard did not answer. He stepped back, one step, then two. But behind him, the security guards were no longer standing still. Two men in black suits lunged forward, gripping Richard's arms tightly. "Let me go!" Richard screamed, struggling. "Do you know who I am?" "We do," one of them replied curtly. "And that's exactly why we can't let you go." The police entered the area beneath the funeral canopy. Everything happened so quickly that no one had time to react. Richard was fully restrained. The white handkerchief slipped from his grasp, fell to the ground, was trampled into the mud. A small image, but enough to reveal the collapse of the mask he had worn all morning. Elsewhere, Dr. Thomas Blake stood trembling. Sweat soaked his forehead. His hands were clenched together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. When the police turned toward him, he avoided their gaze. I only did what I was told," he blurted out, his voice shattered. "I thought she had—" "You thought," Daniel cut in, his voice turning cold. "Or you were told what to think." Blake sank into a nearby chair as if all his strength had been drained away. "I was afraid," he whispered. "He said if I didn't sign, I would lose everything." Margaret Lewis looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes, only deep disappointment. "And because of your fear," she said, "my niece was almost buried alive." Blake said nothing. He could not. Evelyn stirred slightly, this time more clearly. Daniel immediately turned back, bending close to her. "Don't speak," he said quickly but gently. "Just breathe. Everything else can wait." Evelyn opened her eyes, not fully, just a narrow slit, but enough for her gaze to find Daniel. Her lips trembled. A very weak sound escaped. "Why?" The question was not meant for Daniel. It was meant for the man being restrained several meters away. Richard lifted his head. His eyes met Evelyn's, and in that moment, all the power, authority, and control he had once believed were his dissolved. The syringe lay on the ground. The police stood around him. The crowd watched. There was nothing left to hide. Richard lowered his head, not in remorse, but in defeat. Evelyn closed her eyes again, a single tear slipping from the corner, not from physical pain, but because the truth had finally been revealed right in the place where she was supposed to lie forever. Daniel stood there in the middle of the cemetery. His security uniform was stained with dirt. His hands still trembled. But for the first time in many years, he knew one thing for sure. He had not stayed silent. And because of that, a human life had been pulled back from the edge of death. The police siren sounded again, this time no longer distant. One chapter closed, and another, more violent, more real, was beginning. Some questions do not need answers. They only need to be spoken, and all truth lies bare. Why? Evelyn Carter's voice was so weak it nearly dissolved into the air, yet each syllable was sharp as broken glass. It sliced through the remaining chaos in Oak Hill Cemetery, forcing everything into silence. Daniel Brooks stood close beside her, feeling Evelyn's hand trembling faintly beneath the thin burial cloth. Her breathing was still shallow, broken, but every breath was a victory over the death that had just been forced to retreat. Richard Carter stood several meters away, restrained by 2 security guards. His shoulders were no longer straight. His back was no longer proud. The man who had once stood at podiums making decisions for thousands now stood held in place amid mud and the gaze of the crowd. He did not answer, not because there was no answer, but because every answer had become meaningless. "Look at me, Richard." This time Evelyn spoke more clearly. She opened her eyes a little wider, her gaze blurred but still strong enough to find the man who had once been her husband. "Look at me," she repeated, her voice trembling but not weak. "At least, look at me." Richard slowly raised his head. The moment their eyes met, something collapsed entirely in the space between them. Not love, not memory, but illusion. "Why?" Evelyn asked, each word dragged out of an injured chest. "What did I do to make you do this?" Some people in the crowd turned away, not because they did not want to hear, but because they knew what was coming would not be easy. Richard laughed, a dry, hollow laugh, no longer bothering to hide. "Do you really not understand?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Or did you never want to?" Daniel clenched his fist, but he did not intervene. This was no longer his moment. This was Evelyn's. "You had everything," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "Reputation, power, a position in the company. I trusted you." Richard shook his head. "No," he snarled. "You had everything, and I was just the shadow behind the name Carter Systems." The words passed through the crowd like a cold wind. Richard took a step forward, then was stopped. He did not resist. He only looked at Evelyn, his eyes burning with a twisted emotion, part resentment, part craving. "I watched you every day," he said. "You stood before the board. You made decisions. You were celebrated. And me? I was your husband, but I was never the center of any room." Evelyn closed her eyes. The pieces in her mind began to fall into place. The meetings she had been excluded from, the quiet resistance to her decisions, the growing distance she had blamed on work. "I never wanted to take anything from you," she said softly. "But you did," Richard cut in, "by never realizing I was slowly dying beside you." A heavy silence fell. Margaret Lewis stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes filled with pain mixed with anger. "So," she said slowly, "you chose to kill my niece?" Richard turned toward her, his gaze turning cold. "I chose to take back what was always meant to be mine," he replied. The words struck like a hammer. "What belonged to you?" Daniel spoke, his voice low but sharp. "A human life?" Richard whipped around toward him. "What do you know?" he shouted. "You're just a cemetery guard, a homeless nobody someone felt sorry for." Daniel did not step back. He looked straight at Richard, not with hatred, not with contempt, only with the quiet, painful calm of someone who had seen too much loss. "Maybe," Daniel said. "But I've never believed I had the right to decide who gets to live and who has to die." The words were not loud, but they fell like stone. The police stepped forward. "Mr. Richard Carter," one officer said clearly, "you are being detained on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder." The sound of handcuffs clicked shut, cold and final. Richard flinched, then laughed again, this time a laugh of desperation. "It's all because of you." He turned back toward Evelyn. "If you weren't so obsessed with power—" "No," Evelyn interrupted. Her voice was weak but absolute. "Not because of me," she said, "but because you refuse to face the emptiness inside yourself." Richard froze. For the first time, he had no reply. Nearby, Dr. Thomas Blake stood, shaking. When the police turned toward him, his legs gave way, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I'm sorry," he broke down, crying. "I was afraid. I wasn't brave enough." Evelyn looked at him. No anger, no shouting, only a disappointment so deep it needed no words. "You swore to protect life," she said, "and you chose silence." Blake lowered his head. This silence was a confession. An ambulance rushed into the cemetery, its siren wailing urgently. Paramedics quickly moved to Evelyn, placing her on a stretcher. Daniel stepped back, making room. As they prepared to take her away, Evelyn suddenly reached for his hand. Her grip was weak, but warm. "You," she whispered. "What's your name?" "Daniel," he answered softly. "Daniel Brooks." Evelyn nodded slightly. "You saved me," she said. "Not just my life, but the truth." Daniel lowered his head. "I only did what anyone should do," he said. "Not turn away." The stretcher was wheeled off. Evelyn left the cemetery, the place that had nearly become her grave. Richard was escorted in the opposite direction. Two paths diverged, one toward the hospital, one toward a cell. And between those two paths, Daniel Brooks remained standing. His security uniform was smeared with mud. His face was exhausted. But for the first time in many years, he no longer felt invisible. Margaret Lewis stepped up beside him. She placed a hand on his shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You did more than you think," she said. "You reminded us what it means to be human." Daniel watched the ambulance disappear behind the rows of maple trees. One chapter of life had closed, but he did not yet know that the next chapter of his own life had only just begun. Some truths do not need to be shouted. They only need a space quiet enough to be heard. That afternoon, Northwestern Memorial Hospital was bathed in the pale gray light of an autumn day. There were no police sirens anymore, no bursts of sobbing, only the familiar scent of disinfectant and the steady rhythm of hurried footsteps along the long corridors. Evelyn Carter was taken into the recovery room. The doctors worked quickly and precisely, asking no questions beyond what was necessary. The heart monitor emitted a steady sound, not loud, but enough to tell everyone in the room that she was here, alive, and returning. Margaret Lewis sat on the row of chairs outside, her hands tightly clasped together. She had been sitting like that for a long time, unable to count how many times she had prayed. Each time the door opened, she sprang to her feet, then sat back down again as a clock hand stuck between two moments of hope and fear. Daniel Brooks stood at the end of the hallway. He did not sit. He did not lean against the wall. He stood there, his hands in his jacket pockets, staring at the polished floor where a faint reflection of himself appeared. A man in a dirt-stained security uniform, inside a hospital where everything was clean, orderly, and seemingly not meant for people like him. A nurse passed by and looked at him a second longer than usual. Not with disdain, but with curiosity, mixed with a hint of caution. Daniel was used to that. He was used to being seen without truly being acknowledged. About an hour later, a young doctor stepped out of the room. "Mrs. Carter is out of danger," he said. "Her body is still weak, but she's responding well. She needs complete rest." Margaret burst into tears. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears falling onto the back of her wrinkled hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank God." The doctor nodded, then turned to Daniel. "You're the one who—" he asked hesitantly. Daniel gave a slight nod. "Yes." "She asked about you," the doctor said, when she regained consciousness. Daniel froze. I don't need—" "She wants to see you," the doctor said, then smiled faintly. "When she's alert enough." Margaret turned to Daniel, her gaze softening. "Stay," she said, "at least until she's fully awake." Daniel hesitated. Stay meant what? Stay in a world he had never believed he belonged to? But then he nodded, just a tiny nod. Night fell slowly over the hospital. Warm yellow lights stretched along the corridors, softening the sharp edges of the long day. The steady hum of machines became a familiar background rhythm. When Daniel was led into the room, Evelyn was awake. She looked very different from the woman in the coffin that morning. Her face was still pale, but there was a faint blush on her cheeks. Her eyes were tired but clear. When she saw Daniel, her gaze settled on him. Not hurried, not probing, just a slow recognition, as if fitting a vital piece back into place. "You came?" Evelyn said softly. Daniel stood near the door, not daring to step closer. "The doctor said you need rest," he replied. "Please," Evelyn said, her voice weak but firm. "Don't stand so far away." Daniel took one step forward, then another. The distance between them was no longer one of status or circumstance. It was only the distance between two human beings who had crossed the boundary between life and death in very different ways. "I owe you a thank you," Evelyn said. "Perhaps many thank yous." Daniel shook his head. "I don't need that," he said. "You saved me," she interrupted gently. "And I need to understand why." Daniel fell silent. In his mind, old memories began to rise, not loudly, but persistently, like a fine, unending rain. "Because I once failed to save someone," he said after a long while. Evelyn did not press him. She waited. 7 years ago, Daniel continued, his voice lowering. "I was a software engineer. Not rich, but getting by. I had a wife, a daughter." He paused, swallowed. "Her name was Lily. She liked to draw. She drew our whole family holding hands and taped it to the refrigerator. I used to think that was enough." Evelyn listened, her eyes never leaving him. "My company went bankrupt," Daniel said. "I lost my job. I looked for work everywhere, but the market changed faster than I expected. I grew old in the eyes of recruiters." He gave a faint smile, not a happy one. "The money ran out. Stress, arguments. And then one day, they left. My wife left a note," he went on. "She said she was tired and that there was a truth I had never been prepared to hear. Evelyn inhaled softly. The girl wasn't my biological daughter, Daniel said. I loved her like my whole world, but it turned out I had never truly belonged to that story. A heavy silence settled over the room. Daniel looked down at his hands. I lost my house, lost my car, lost everything. There were nights I stood on a bridge thinking that one step would be enough. He looked up, his gaze steady. But I didn't jump. Not because I was brave. Maybe just because I wasn't ready to disappear. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. The job at the cemetery, Daniel said, was the only place that took me. No questions, no judgment. Just show up. He looked straight at Evelyn. When I heard them talking about you, about a rushed funeral, about silence, I knew that feeling. The feeling of a life being treated as something that could be erased. His voice dropped. I've stayed silent too many times in my life. But that time, I couldn't. Evelyn closed her eyes. A tear slid down her temple. You stood up, she said, when so many people with more power than you did nothing. Daniel did not reply. Outside, the city of Chicago glittered in the night. The lights looked like artificial stars, cold but enduring. Daniel, Evelyn said, her voice tired but warm, I don't know what the future will hold, but I know one thing. She opened her eyes and looked at him. You are not invisible anymore. Daniel stood still. He did not know how to respond, because for the first time in many years, someone was looking at him as a whole human being, not a victim, not a hero, just a human being who chose not to turn away. Out in the hallway, Margaret Lewis quietly rose and gently closed the door to the room. She smiled through her tears, because she knew. Some meetings do not save a single life, but save an entire lifetime. There are places where silence is no longer a choice, because every word spoken can change the fate of an entire life. That morning, the Illinois State Courthouse was packed. From early on, television vans lined both sides of the street. Cameras were trained on the gray stone doors of the building where every footstep carried the weight of history and justice. The scrolling headline on morning news broadcasts repeated a title that stunned the entire nation. Female CEO returns from the dead, husband and personal doctor charged with murder conspiracy. Inside the courtroom, the tension was almost tangible. The public gallery was filled. Some people had come out of curiosity, some out of outrage, and some to witness with their own eyes something that seemed as though it belonged only in movies. Evelyn Carter entered the courtroom. She was no longer lying motionless in a coffin, no longer breathing faintly on a stretcher. She walked slowly but steadily. One hand rested lightly on the back of a chair, the other supported by Daniel Brooks. She wore a simple black dress, no elaborate jewelry, no heavy makeup, only the calm resilience of someone who had looked death straight in the eye and returned. The courtroom fell silent for a moment. No one said a word, but many people held their breath. Across the room, Richard Carter sat in the defendant's seat. No perfectly tailored suit, no confident posture. The detention uniform made him look smaller, more hollow, but his eyes were still cold, still stubborn, still carried the arrogance that had long been etched into his very being. Beside him, Dr. Thomas Blake kept his head lowered. His hands trembled on his knees. Sweat beaded on his forehead, soaking into the collar of his shirt. Judge Helen Morris, a gray-haired woman with a stern face, struck the gavel. "The court is now in session." The prosecutor stood. His voice was clear, not raised. "Your Honor," he said, "this is not merely a criminal case. It is a story of greed, betrayal, and a life that was nearly buried because of power." He turned toward the defendants. The defendant, Richard Carter, poisoned his wife with a substance that slowed her heart rate, causing the victim to be declared dead while she was still alive. The defendant, Thomas Blake, in his role as a physician, signed a death certificate in violation of both ethics and the law. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Richard straightened his back slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile, a familiar reflex, as if he were still in a boardroom where a smile could conceal everything. "We will prove," the prosecutor continued, "that if not for the actions of a single witness, a man with no power, no status, then today the victim would not be sitting here." Many eyes instinctively turned toward Daniel. He sat quietly, hands resting on his knees. His shirt was clean, his hair neatly trimmed, but the familiar weariness remained. He did not look up. He did not seek anyone's gaze. He had never been accustomed to being the center of attention. "We call our witness," the prosecutor said. "Daniel Brooks." Daniel stood. Each step he took toward the witness stand echoed clearly in the hushed courtroom. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. When he turned to face the room, his gaze swept briefly across the public seats, then paused softly on Evelyn. She nodded, not to encourage him, only to say, "You are not alone." "Mr. Brooks," the prosecutor asked, "please describe what you witnessed on the night before the funeral." Daniel took a deep breath. "That night," he said, his voice low and measured, "I was on duty at Oak Hill Cemetery. Around midnight, I noticed a luxury car parked in the rear area." He paused for a second, as if making sure he was still steady. "I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but they were speaking loudly. I heard Mr. Richard say that the drug has taken effect. She's cold now. Bury her early tomorrow before anyone suspects." The courtroom seemed to freeze. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Lies!" he shouted. "What would a homeless man know?" "Order!" The judge struck the gavel. Daniel did not turn around. He continued. "Dr. Blake said he was afraid. Mr. Richard replied that if he didn't sign the death certificate, he would lose everything." A sob rose from the public gallery. Evelyn closed her eyes, her hand clenching tightly. The prosecutor nodded, then turned back to the bench. "Mr. Brooks," he asked, "what motivated you to act? Were you paid?" Daniel shook his head. "I received nothing," he said, "except the knowledge that I couldn't go on living if I stayed silent." The defense attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection!" he said loudly. "My client cannot be convicted based solely on the testimony of someone who was once homeless without credibility." Daniel turned and looked straight at him. "I may be poor," he said, his voice calm but resonant. "I may have slept under bridges, but I do not lie." The courtroom fell utterly silent. The judge nodded. "The witness may continue." What followed were scientific findings, forensic reports, the toxin, the syringe. Everything came together, cold, precise, emotionless, but enough to form a complete picture. Then it was Richard's turn to speak. He looked directly at Evelyn. "You always thought you were right," he said. "You loved your company more than anyone. I only wanted what should have been mine." Evelyn stood. Her voice was not loud, but it was firm. No one has the right to take another person's life to fill their own emptiness, she said. You were not abandoned. You refused to stand in the light with me. Richard laughed loudly, desperately. I have no regrets, he shouted. None at all. The judge's gavel struck for the final time. Defendant Richard Carter, she said. This court sentences you to life imprisonment for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Defendant Thomas Blake, life imprisonment for violation of medical ethics and complicity. Richard was led away. No more shouting, no more defiant stares. Only an empty man, consumed by his own greed. Evelyn sat down. Her shoulders trembled slightly. Daniel reached out his hand. She took it. Not as a benefactor, not as the one who was saved, but as two human beings who had walked through darkness together and finally seen the light. And in that moment, the entire courtroom understood. This was not just a trial. This was the return of justice. Some doors do not open with keys. They open with trust. That afternoon, when the trial ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, Daniel Brooks stood alone on the stone steps of the courthouse. The Chicago sky was strangely clear, as if the city itself had just shed an invisible burden. He did not know where to go. For many years, Daniel's life had been confined to night shifts, empty streets, and places where no one noticed his presence. Even today, when everything had changed, that sense of being adrift had not yet left him. Evelyn Carter stepped out behind him. She no longer needed support. Her steps were slow but steady. Her eyes no longer carried the confusion of her early days of waking, but instead a new calm, the calm of someone who had faced the rawest truth of her life. Daniel, she called. He turned around. You need to rest, he said out of old habit, as if he were still standing in the hospital. The doctors. I'm fine, Evelyn smiled softly. And I want to talk to you. They stood facing each other in the vast courtyard where the last noises of the press had faded. No cameras, no lights, just two people who had just walked through a storm. Do you have any plans yet? Evelyn asked. Daniel was silent for a moment. No, he answered honestly. I still have a night shift at the cemetery tonight. Evelyn looked at him, her gaze lowering. You don't need to go back there anymore, she said. Daniel frowned. I don't understand. Evelyn took a deep breath as if weighing every word. I'm not saying this as a wealthy woman, she said, but as someone you pulled back from death. She took one more step forward, keeping just enough distance so Daniel would not feel pressured. Carter Systems needs people who don't turn away when the truth becomes inconvenient, Evelyn said. And I need someone I can trust. Daniel shook his head immediately. I don't belong in that world, he said. I left it a long time ago. No, Evelyn replied softly. That world left you. Those are two different things. Daniel did not answer. He looked down at his hands, hands that had once written code, once held his daughter, once trembled in cold nights beneath a bridge. He was not sure they still belonged on a clean keyboard in a brightly lit boardroom. I don't want you to come back out of gratitude, Evelyn continued. I want you to come back because you deserve to. That sentence stopped Daniel cold. Not because it was grand, but because no one had ever said that to him without conditions. A few days later, Daniel stepped into the Carter Systems building. No one recognized him. The simple suit made him look very different from the cemetery guard he once was. Yet the sense of not belonging remained. He walked slowly, avoiding people's eyes, as if afraid that if someone looked at him a second too long, they would discover he did not belong here. Evelyn was waiting for him. in her office. Not the glamorous CEO office seen in magazines, but a room filled with natural light, old wooden bookshelves, and a few family photos placed on the desk. "I didn't invite you here to be a symbol," Evelyn said as he sat down. "I invited you here to work." Daniel nodded. "You'll start with small things," she continued. "Review documents, check schedules, give your opinion when you think it's necessary." Daniel was slightly surprised. "No title?" Evelyn smiled. "Titles can come later," she said. "Trust cannot." In the early days, Daniel worked very quietly. He arrived early, left late, sat in corners, no one noticed. Some people were curious, some were suspicious, but no one asked, until one afternoon. A board meeting was underway. Members sat around a long table, familiar faces of power and numbers. An important presentation about a new data system suddenly ran into trouble. The screen went black. Files would not open. The atmosphere in the room tightened. Overlapping voices, anxious looks. Before Evelyn could speak, Daniel stood up. "Let me take a look," he said, his voice small, almost asking permission. A few people turned to look at him, their eyes full of doubt. But Evelyn nodded. Daniel stepped to the computer. His fingers touched the keyboard, hesitant at first, then faster. Familiar lines of code returned as if they had never left him. A few minutes passed. The screen lit up. The presentation reappeared, complete. A silence fell over the room. "Where did you learn to do that?" a board member asked. Daniel looked up. "I used to be a software engineer," he replied. "Before everything collapsed." Evelyn stood. "No," she said, looking around the room. "Before the world stopped making room for him." She turned to Daniel. "Starting today," Evelyn said clearly, "Daniel Brooks will be my special advisor." No one objected, not out of fear, but because they had just witnessed real competence. After the meeting, Daniel stood alone in the empty room. A strange feeling spread through his chest, not victory, but return. Evelyn walked over and set a cup of coffee on the table. "How does it feel?" she asked. Daniel thought for a moment. "I'm still scared," he said honestly. "But I don't feel invisible anymore." Evelyn smiled. "No one should be buried just because they once fell," she said. "I was almost buried alive, and you were almost buried by forgetting." Daniel looked at her. Two people, two very different paths, but sharing one moment, being given a second chance. Outside the window, the city of Chicago drifted toward dusk. The last light of day bathed the tall buildings in gold, like a quiet promise that darkness, no matter how long, can never stay forever. And for Daniel Brooks, for the first time in many years, the future was no longer an empty, frightening space. It was a road, not yet clear, but opening. Some feelings are never named, not because they are not significant enough, but because they are deep enough to know when to stop. In the days following that board meeting, the rhythm of life at Carter Systems gradually stabilized once more. The numbers returned to their trajectories, the flood of emails carried the familiar breath of work, and the name Evelyn Carter reappeared in the news. This time, not as the woman who returned from death, but as a CEO restructuring her entire empire with a new spirit. Daniel Brooks walked through the long glass corridors, carrying a thin folder of documents. He no longer kept his head lowered as before, yet he was still not used to holding it high. His confidence was not loud. It came slowly, quietly, like a morning after a long night of rain. In the evenings, when the office floors gradually went dark, Daniel often stayed a little longer, not because he was asked to. It was simply easier for him to breathe in that quiet. And often, on evenings like that, Evelyn would stop by his office. No appointments, no assistants in tow, just two people sitting across from each other, each with a cup of warm tea beneath the soft yellow light. They talked a great deal, not about stocks, not about strategy, but about things neither of them had ever had time to talk about before. Evelyn told him about her early startup years, when she had to choose between being a present mother and building a company from nothing. She spoke of nights spent sleeping at the office, of missed dinners, of loneliness, even while standing in rooms full of people. Daniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer advice. He listened, with the patience of someone who had lived long enough in silence. In return, Daniel told her small stories, stories not found in any resume, about freezing nights on cemetery shifts, about learning to cherish every morning he still woke up to, about the feeling of realizing that he had not disappeared the way he once believed. Between them, an invisible thread slowly formed, not rushed, not loud, but strong enough for Evelyn to realize something that both frightened her and softened her heart. She was waiting for those evenings. One late night, as a light rain fell over the city of Chicago, the two of them stood by a large window looking down at the slow-moving stream of cars below. Reflections of light stretched across the glass like long trails, like memories that refused to end. "Did you ever think you'd be here?" Evelyn asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "I once thought my life was already over," he replied. "I just didn't know it yet." Evelyn smiled, a tired smile, but a genuine one. "There are days," she said, "when I stand in the middle of everything I've built and wonder whether it ever truly saved me." Daniel turned to look at her. "Maybe," he said slowly, "it wasn't meant to save you. Maybe it was meant for you to save others." Evelyn froze. Those words reached her in a very different way, not as praise, not as comfort. They felt like a truth she had never dared to face. In that moment, the distance between them seemed to close by one step. And at that very moment, Daniel gently stepped back. Evelyn noticed, not with her eyes, but with intuition. A few days later, Daniel asked to see her one morning. "Evelyn," he said, standing in front of her desk, his voice calm but carrying something unfamiliar. "I want to tell you something." She looked up. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel took a breath. "I've met someone," he said. "Her name is Elena." Evelyn did not respond immediately. A minimal beat passed, too brief for anyone else to notice, but long enough for something to tighten gently in her chest. "Elena works at a community center near the cemetery," Daniel continued, unaware of the wave that had just passed through Evelyn. "She often brings food to the night shift workers. We talk, very naturally." Evelyn smiled, a perfect smile, a familiar one. "You deserve good things," she said. "Truly." Daniel nodded, relieved, as if a weight had just been lifted. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "I don't want there to be any misunderstanding between us." When he left, the room suddenly felt too quiet. Evelyn remained seated for a long time. She did not cry right away. She looked out at the city, where life continued as if nothing had ever happened. And only when the door fully closed did the tears fall. Not violently, not painfully, just the quiet sadness of someone who has realized some beautiful things, they are not meant to be held. That night, Evelyn stayed very late at the office. She walked through each room, turning off every light, as if tidying up a part of herself. She understood. Daniel was not leaving her. He was living the opportunity she herself had given him. And if she genuinely cared for him, she could not pull him toward herself to fill her own emptiness. A few months later, Daniel announced his engagement. He spoke with simple joy, unshowy. Elena was a gentle woman with warm eyes and a slow voice, the kind of person who made Daniel feel he did not need to prove anything. Evelyn was the first to congratulate him. She offered to sponsor the wedding, not as a favor, but as a blessing. The wedding took place in a small garden behind an old church. White flowers, soft sunlight, no extravagance. Daniel stood there in a dark blue suit, his eyes shining in a way Evelyn had never seen before. She sat in the front row. When Daniel and Elena held hands, Evelyn applauded along with everyone else. This time, no regret made her turn away. Only a strange peace, the peace of someone who has learned how to love without possessing. When the ceremony ended, Daniel came over to her. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes gentle. "No," she replied. "Thank you for living." As they parted, Evelyn knew that a chapter within her had closed, not with pain, not with resentment, just a slow, necessary maturity. Because there are some loves that do not need to walk together for a lifetime. They only need to appear at the right moment to teach us how to become better human beings. Some endings do not arrive with fireworks, no dazzling lights, no vows spoken before a crowd. They arrive very quietly, like a morning after a long night when light touches the window and one realizes they are still here. The following spring, the garden behind the Carter estate bloomed with lavender. A gentle breeze carried its fragrance along the stone paths. Chicago felt less cold, less harsh, as if the city itself had learned to breathe more slowly. Evelyn Carter stood by the veranda, a light coat draped over her shoulders, one hand resting on the wooden railing. Before her, rows of flowers stretched beneath the early sunlight. Everything felt so peaceful that it was almost unreal. She had survived. Not only death, but the bitterness that had once imprisoned her within her own life. After the trial, Evelyn did not rush back into her old rhythm. She took time to restructure Carter Systems in a different way, less glamorous but more enduring. Meetings became less tense. Decisions were weighed with both data and humanity in mind. Daniel Brooks continued working beside her, not under spotlights but in quiet exchanges. He no longer feared being seen, nor did he seek attention. He worked the same way he had saved Evelyn, quietly, precisely, and without turning away. And then life, in its own way, continued to unfold. Daniel married Elena in a simple ceremony. No display, no media. Only people who understood that happiness does not need to be proven. Evelyn sat in the front row, applauding slowly, her smile calm. A few months later, Daniel held his firstborn son in his arms, a boy named Daniel Jr., as a reminder that some life paths thought to be broken were merely waiting for a turn to continue. Evelyn visited them on a softly sunlit afternoon. She held the baby, feeling the slight warmth pressed against her chest. In that moment, something gentle flowed through her heart, not regret, but gratitude. Because she understood. Some people do not walk with us to the end of the road, but they help us walk the most essential part of it. As for Evelyn, she too stepped into a new chapter. She met Jonathan Reed at a community medical fundraiser, a man who spoke little about achievements but always asked about people. Jonathan did not look at Evelyn as a symbol or a sensational story. He looked at her as someone who had walked through darkness and still chose light. They talked, then laughed, then met again. Everything came slowly, just enough to harm no one. When Jonathan proposed, Evelyn did not hesitate, not out of fear of loneliness, but because she had learned how to open her heart without losing herself. Evelyn's wedding took place in that same garden where lavender was in full bloom. She walked slowly, no longer rushing. In the front row, Daniel and Elena sat together, holding their sleeping baby. They smiled, their blessing spoken without words. When the ceremony ended, everyone gathered beneath the sunset. Glasses were raised, laughter drifted lightly in the breeze. No one spoke of death. No one mentioned the courtroom. All of that had been left behind. A year later, life blossomed in ways no one had dared to be certain of. Evelyn welcomed her first daughter, Sophia. The baby had clear eyes, wide open to the world as if she had never known fear. Evelyn held her, tears falling, not for the past, but because the present was so full. Daniel and Elena came to visit. Daniel held Sophia, his hands steady with the familiar rhythm of a father. Evelyn looked at him and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel understood, and he nodded. One honey gold evening, both families gathered in the Carter garden. Children lay on the grass, kicking their feet in the cool air. The adults sat in a circle, talking about tiny things, meals, sleep, ordinary dreams. The sun sank behind the trees. The last light of day slid across the garden like a promise. Daniel raised his glass. "From ashes to dawn," he said, his voice low but steady. Evelyn smiled and replied softly, "Yes, from ashes to dawn." They understood each other without further words, because they had stood in the darkest place, and they knew that light does not arrive by miracle. It comes by choice. The choice to speak when silence is easier. The choice to trust when doubt feels safer. The choice to love without possession. The choice to live, even after once wanting to let go. As the years passed, Daniel and Evelyn stayed in touch, not as people who missed their chance, but as two souls who had passed through fire and understood the value of warmth. On quiet afternoons, they sat on a wooden bench watching the children run after the sunlight. No one spoke of the past, but both remembered, so they could cherish the present. That may be the rarest kind of love, not romantic, not loud, but redemptive. And if there is one thing this story wishes to leave with you, it is this: not everyone saves your heart. Some save your life. And sometimes, that is the greatest love of all. Not every hero wears a suit. Some wear an old uniform and carry wounds no one sees. If this story touched you, perhaps it is because somewhere in your life, someone once saved you with nothing more than a quiet act. Pause for a breath. Share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment. Your story might warm someone else. And if you love stories that touch our humanity, follow Deep Life Tales. Because sometimes, the deepest stories do not need to shout. They stay with us. Fade out.